Evening, everybody. How are we all feeling? Out of 5. How are you feeling out of 5? 5s, 4s, 5s. Not many people wanting to participate. I'm aware it's been a long and very arduous day for your brains. So hopefully Paul will be able to ignite your brain cells again and get you thinking about the issues in his new book, which is called, funnily enough, Unlocking Sustainable Cities, a Manifesto for Real Change. So I'll allow Paul to introduce himself, and the lecture will be just under an hour and with time for questions, if that's okay. When it's time for questions, I'll come round with the mic. Paul.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm just going to get the clicker so I can don't have to stand behind the desk. And I'm assuming this works, hopefully. No, it's not doing much in the way of clicking. Does that no. Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. So, thanks everyone for being here with me tonight. I'm delighted to I'm always delighted to speak here because I've taught here over the years and on various MSCs, and it's just thrilling to engage with people who are just here because you love the ideas, but you love the practice of it, and that for me is fantastic, right? Because I really want to get stuck into a really good debate with you tonight, and I want to share my ideas with you based around this new book that I've got out, Unlocking Sustainable Cities, a Manifesto for Real Change. And I called it a Manifesto for Real Change purposefully because I want to put these ideas out there in the context of this growing climate emergency and also this social emergency, which has been going on for years, right? The great, hidden kind of poverty and social inequality emergency, and really focus our minds on the significant and rapid and tangible shifts we need to make in our urban environments to respond to these crises, right? And so I'm getting this book out as far as wide as I can, and it's part of a growing debate, so that's really exciting. So I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and let's open it up for questions, because it'll mean different things for different people in different places, yeah? And it's a fairly broad-ranging talk. So, and it's got some answers, it's not got all the answers, it's got more questions sometimes, but that's the key thing, right? And so I'm Professor of Urban Futures at the University of Leeds. I'm in the School of Geography. I'm a kind of lifelong geographer, but I like geography because it weaves together both physical and human elements of our understanding, but also gives a broad-ranging insights into kind of what underpins some of the problems we face, yeah? So I'm really interested in engaging with people in terms of what are the real challenges, but what are the tangible solutions that can emerge from that. And a lot of it is hooked around my book. So I've just got onto Twitter. Twitter's great, isn't it? I've just got onto the Twitter world. It's quite fun. And so if you're doing that kind of thing, it'll be fun to engage with you. And I've got copies to sell afterwards for £10, so that's great. So this has come out of a Radical Geography book series, edited by Danny Dorling, one of my colleagues, who's kind of a great kind of radical commentator. So I think what we're trying to do in the discipline of geography is to put ourselves out there and the ideas we generate within the discipline to kind of get some real purchase on the world. And what I see from my own undergraduates and master's students is a real desire to kind of take these issues on, not just within the academy, but within local government, private sector, and civil society. And that's one of the big themes I wanted to return to. Now, what I've been doing over the years is collecting great examples of inspiring change as an urbanist, right? And there's loads of great examples out there. Things like Walk My City, across US countries, with people trying to promote walking culture rather than dominant car culture. The Better Block Foundation that's taken up vacant parking lots and reimagining them into spaces of joy and play and communing. The Miraval Community Foundation in Mexico City that's taking derelict land and re-engaging it, re-envisioning it for community use. The urban consulates in Philadelphia who are gathering people together to talk about the critical issues in their neighbourhood. And my own city, Leeds Playbox, which is dumping these great shipping containers onto parks and gathering people together. So as an urban geographer, I'm fascinated about this potential just bubbling below the surface, right? That's what really excites me. But the question is, how do we unlock that potential? Because it's currently locked up. It's currently being weighed down by a whole bunch of institutional, cultural factors that are keeping it locked down. So this is a big question I want to pose at the beginning of the session. What are the structural conditions that drive urban unsustainability, right? Because we all know, because we're all involved in loads of great stuff in our own lives, why aren't we making a breakthrough? What are the structural conditions that inhibit that broad level change coming from these micro projects? And I think a lot of you, doing the kind of masters here around cities and communities, I think it'll link with a lot of things we're reflecting on in terms of how do we unlock this potential within our urban neighbourhoods? That's what I'm interested in my academic career. And I've one foot in the academy, but I've one foot outside the academy, so I'm a bit of a serial social entrepreneur. So I set up lots of things in the city, and many of you might know I live in this Lilac co-housing project in Leeds, one of these big flagship award-winning co-housing cooperatives. I set up Leeds Community Homes to try to drive this movement forward. So I'm interested in how we can get these micro projects connected to lead to this bigger scale change. So any of the things I'm talking about tonight, if you want to use me as a human recorder, if you want to slow down on a few issues or speed up over some issues, I'm really happy to adjust this, because I do this talk quite a lot now to tailor to your needs. So I'm really keen to do that. So what are the structural conditions that drive urban unsustainability? Well, I'm going to put three out there, right? Growth, carbon, and capitalism. I'm going to be provocative, and I think what I want to do is kind of create a deeper level of analysis of what these things might be, right? And I'm going to go through these briefly before I get into looking at some city systems, right? I'm going to look at nature and transport and energy and community economics, those four. But first, I want to just tackle these three things, because some of the issues that are locking us into unsustainable modes of life, right? Let's take them one by one. Let's just have a look at that growth thing. I mean, the key thing about the growth, so I'm suggesting that all three together can create a real, genuine triple bottom line for what I'm calling sustainable cities, right? And they're three posts, a whole new fence. The first one is this what we call a post-growth storyline. A narrative, a story for our common age, for our country, for our cities, for our households, for our nation, beyond the age of ceaseless economic growth, of privatization, of commodification of resources. What Kate Raworth in her wonderful book, Don't Economics, has called a safe and just operating space for humanity, and we'll look at that in a second. And then the second one around the carbon challenge, or what I call in my book the post-carbon challenge, yeah? Taking my cue from the wonderful organisation in the States, the Post-Carbon Institute. What is this urban world beyond our high dependency lock-in to fossil fuel resources? And what we've got now is a framework for this 1.5 degree Paris target, which is a really key target to aim for. But one of the things we don't know, we're not clear about what this means for urban areas. Yeah, we're kind of grappling with what it means for nations and the international community, but what it means for our urban neighbours, for our cities, is less known. And then what I call post-capitalist interventions, right? Because if we're going to talk about the C word, right? If we're going to say, look, there's a problem with our economic and social system, then what comes after it? What is post-capitalism, right? And I'll have a look at that in a minute, because I've just written a paper on these with my colleague around this junction point, right? Capitalism, post-capitalism. And we talk about the commons, joyful doing, as in work that we enjoy, and useful production, useful things that we can produce, right? So I'm going to look at these three in turn. So the first one is about this storyline, and this is Kate Raworth's Don't Economics, but the point is we're lacking a narrative, we're lacking a story. What is Britain for? What is Wales for? What is Machynlleth for? What is CAT for? We kind of know what CAT's for, but possibly even needs reinventing itself in the 21st century. What I ask when I do these talks is, what is this place for? Yeah? What are we here for? And I think starting with that kind of existential challenge is the cue to develop some kind of new narrative or storyline, because we're quite considerably lost without one. Having a new narrative through which we can develop public policy and public debates and allocate resources is absolutely essential. And that's why, as a country, we're so lost with things like Brexit, right? And I want to explore how those kinds of narratives and new storylines can emerge. And this storyline that Kate Ralph presents is quite enticing because she explores that bit in the middle between and beyond shortfall and overshoot, beyond the excessive practices of the millionaires, the billionaires, the corporations who are unraveling our world, and those entrenched in poverty and low-income communities in the middle of the donut. Yeah, how can we get back into that safe centre and create a narrative that it's a good place to be for all of us? Now, obviously, going to the post-carbon world, this was a 2015 historic moment in Paris. Yeah, it was a whole new roadmap set. And subsequently, we've seen that in Poland last year, that we have to hold rising global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees. I think an audience like this is very familiar with these kinds of arguments. But the key challenge is, how do we do that? What does this 1.5 degree challenge mean? Okay, the IPCC is going to put some messages out to the national government so we can start to renegotiate our own roadmap as a nation. We're seeing Nottingham pitching it at 2028 to be zero carbon. We see Manchester in the 2030s. Right? My own city, Leeds, is a little bit lost, doesn't know really how to respond. But other cities in Britain, other localities are saying we have to go on this roadmap faster and quicker than we first possibly imagined. And this is the kind of thing, this is even out of date already. I mean, this is only an 80% roadmap, but the point I want to show from this diagram is that getting off this big curve, right, and getting on this really rapid downward curve is interesting because we need to break it down into wedges, right, into reduction wedges. But what are the aspects? What are the components of those wedges? What are they made in terms of actual daily social practices? What are they made up from? Yeah, and I think that's the gap in our thinking in terms of understanding them as a collective picture. And of course, we've got to do all this stuff as well. So not only have we got to get on that roadmap, we've got to do all these things. And number 11 is a big one for us, the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, the UN Habitat Agenda. So there's a big basket of issues to be dealt with, right? Which leads to this kind of thing. So we'd probably need to do this stuff anyway. And we just need to get on with the historic tasks that have been with us, right? Ever since landmark reports such as the Brundtland Committee and the Limits to Growth back in the 60s, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, you know, this is all very familiar territory, but it's an accumulated body of knowledge which has been pointing in this kind of direction for well over half a century, yeah, ever since the post-war growth deal started to unravel. So this is the post-carbon urban challenge for me is the big one, right? How do we get ourselves off that high dependency, high growth trajectory and storyline? Now the third one, post-capitalism. I don't like to bandy around the words capitalism without kind of exploring what the heck we mean by it, right? So we, in a recent paper with my colleague Andrea Pusey, which you can read now, it's out, this paper, in Progress in Human Geography, we pinned it down to three things. Oh, capitalism, right? So it's enclosure. Quite a violent process. It started here 300 years ago. We were very good at it, kicked the peasants off the land, creating industrial cities. That's a different story, but it's part of our story. Through which we created what we call abstract labour, which separates us from the outcomes of activities, right? If you make that pencil in that pencil factory, you sell that pencil, you get a small fraction of the surplus value generated from the sale of that pencil, but the pencil is not yours, right? That's alienated labour. And it's wrapped up in everything we do. And then we commodify products. So we organise everything. We organise everything in our lives around a social relationship which commodifies, right? So these three things are at the heart of what capitalism is. So when people say, oh, it's just capitalism, that's some texture to it. Those are the things that we mean by it as a shorthand. So if we want to somehow unravel capitalism because it's not an optimal social system, it doesn't allocate flourishing very well, it's very inefficient, it externalizes problems, all that kind of stuff. What is the mirror opposite? Well, rather than enclosure, let's have commons. Let's have self-managed spaces and collective ownership of property and social goods and services, yeah, which are owned in common and the surplus value is shared in common. Let's have doing rather than abstract labour. My favourite author, John Holloway, and if you haven't read his stuff, it's lovely stuff to read. Capitalism, How to Change the World Without Taking Power. He's a great author, lives in Mexico. He talks about doing. Purposeful activity, not determined by others, yeah? Which produces use value, not exchange value. Those moments in our lives where we produce things for ourselves, for the love of producing them, that have some meaning to ourselves and others. And then socially useful production, yeah? Which are embedded in what we call the social and solidarity economy. Goods and services based on actual material needs and desires. Imagine creating an economy based around that, rather than the bullshit jobs on one side, as David Graeber calls them, the huge, vast waste sinks of the corporate economy where people go in to spend years of their advanced training to figure out financial derivatives and other useless financial products which are destroying the planet. And on the other side, the hospitality, retail, distribution sectors, which are generating precarious labour throughout the world. Yeah, our economy, the work we generate in our economy is so fundamentally inefficient and deploys work in such a fundamentally inefficient way. How could we re-engage it to create socially useful production, right? So those are my three. Commons, doing, and socially useful production. That, for me, is a post-capitalist future, and that's a particular starting point for a storyline beyond this particular economy we've got, yeah? Now, coming to the things I'm going to look at in terms of cities, it's all about this twin dynamic. Lockdown on one side, and unlock on the other. You could call this creation and resistance. The point there's this twin dynamic is because you can't have one without the other. One of them without the other is naivety, the other without the other is burnout. You've got to have this wonderful, rich relationship between locking down what's bad and negative and erodes and corrodes what's good in our lives and unlocking the potential. And that's what I want to explore in terms of 4 aspects of city life. And I'm also very keen on pitching this around looking at deeper causes. So I always use the iceberg metaphor, that we see stuff on the surface, right? We can see, for example, poor transport systems or brown fossil fuel energy systems, but we need to look into the deeper cause in terms of how they are generated, how they are maintained and perpetuated, if we're going to undo them properly, yeah? So keep those 2 things in mind, the lockdown and unlock, and then the iceberg, looking deeper, to get a kind of rigorous analysis on, what's going on. What are we proposing as policy solutions, yeah? Because that's the game we're in, right? Building alternatives and proposing policy and allocating resources to build different kinds of worlds. So there's 4 chapters in the book, and those are the 4, yeah? And we'll have a little look through them. I can go faster and slower on these in case you've got any favourites, but I'll go through them. Transport often seems to be an interesting one because we all get really het up about how we move around cities, because it's or urban areas or just life, because it's very tangible to us, yeah? So let's have a look at the car-free city, right? The basic proposition, I've got 4 propositions. There's a proposition for each one, yeah? Proposition number 1, we have to lock down car culture. Privatised, corporate-led, fossil fuel, automobile-dependent, growth-based planning, right? And I'm going to talk about car culture in a bit because we're not talking about the car. We're not talking about big anti-car or something. This is, I drive myself. I've got to share several cars. This is not. This is mobility agnostic. What I'm more interested in is how is car culture perpetuated. And so some of the wonderful drawings I've got tonight is from a guy called James Mackay. You might have come across him. He's got this great book called Dreams of a Low Carbon Future. So have a look at that book. He's done these. He's an illustrator, so he's got some wonderful illustrations of what he sees as a low carbon future. So we need to unlock. So the twin dynamic, unlocking some kind of car-free, socially just, zero carbon, common-owned mobility. We'll try and pull these strands together, yeah, to think, what are the conditions through which we create this car-free city? Now, the car-free movement is a very powerful one, and it's obviously being able to frame the problem in very enticing ways. And from the car-free cities movement, we have this kind of thing, yeah? Industrialization's made a terrible mistake when they turned to the automobile, yeah? As the means of getting around. It's a very, very odd mobility choice if you look at it from a quite a neutral, abstract point of view, in terms of the whole basket of consequences it imposes on our societies. It's a very, very odd choice, and let's unpack those a little bit, yeah? Because we're dealing with car culture, and that's what I'm interested in. How do we get to this structural lock-in to this thing called car culture, right? Which it does include the car, right? But it also includes lorries, taxis, buses, and all that kind of stuff. But it's, private automobile, road-based dependency, yeah? It's a set of interconnected, largely invisible issues that permeate and circulate in our society. But it's really, really recent. It's got really only 150-year history. In 1900, at the beginning of last century, in the US, where it all started, right? Anyone want to hazard a guess? How many cars were there in the States? 1900, yeah. I just have a guess, it's fine. Yeah, there was a few thousand, it might have been 40,000 across the whole, but it was a tiny amount. It was an experiment in 1900, yeah? I mean, fast forward just over a century, and now how many cars across the planet? Well, there's about 1.3 billion now, and it's approaching 2 billion by 2030. But the point is, if you're an entrepreneur, that is the best growth of a single product across the entire planetary system of any that you could wish to imagine. But not only a product, but we've deployed and repurposed the entire planet to service the private automobile. Yeah, so its road planning, infrastructure systems, its debt systems, its servicing systems, its credit systems, its advertising systems, you name it. The car culture has been incredibly pervasive, single product, yeah? Incredibly successful and influential single product has gone from nothing very recently to everything now, yeah? So while that's the most annoying thing, it's actually really powerful because it's so new, it can be put back into the box, no problem, yeah? We just got stuck with it. It's just a bit annoying. So the geopolitics of the car is incredibly recent. But, the geopolitics of the car is a complex story, around war, oil, around the geopolitics of territorial control, all feed this car culture, along with very powerfully corporate power, the big 5 or 6 oil producers alongside the big 5 or 6 automobile producers, yeah, and the big 5 or 6 road builders, yeah. So there's a real kind of like military-industrial complex there, as Chomsky would call it, in terms of servicing this one particular product, yeah. So it's quite pervasive and quite strong, and it did perpetuate the entire post-war growth system. But the key thing is, I think, is the psychological lock-in, the way that the growth of advertising has gone hand in hand with the growth of our psychological lock-in to car. Because let's face it, as humans, we do have a particular lock-in to kind of speed, desire, sex, fantasy, social status, right? We have our weak points, but and the car fulfills those quite effectively. And it's about how do we redeploy those desires somewhere else to unlock us from the car, because the psychological lock-in to the car is very strong. I think that's one of the big things we're up against, and to unravel that is very powerful. Would be very powerful. And then mobility and justice that goes with this, yeah. The transport poor communities and the transport rich communities are a striking aspect of almost every urban location. The transport immobilities that are built into this, yeah. So we are dealing with the low-hanging fruit, yeah? And I always call these the low-hanging fruit purposefully because we're quite good at doing this stuff, putting them out as flagships. We can do like rapid transit systems, places like Curitiba that go over the whole city, and we've known about that for 50 years, and people can replicate it. You can, we have cycling holidays in the Netherlands, me and my family. You've got these nationwide, cycle routes, and you can have citywide bike schemes like Offroad that are traveling the world, and so we can do this low-hanging fruit stuff, yeah? So that's the easy stuff, and we can do that. It's technically feasible, it's politically doable, it's affordable. It's just, there's some reasons why we're not rolling that out as a national template, but it'll come. It can come to most places, yeah? And then you can go much deeper, you can take it further beyond the car. You can start to redesign whole neighbourhoods like they're doing in Barcelona, in Pyongyang, in Seoul, in Korea. You can start to take down whole motorways and deculvert and put rivers back and restore natural environments, yeah? So you can take it much further and start to redesign cities on a broader scale away from the car. And then you can also start to move away from the car as a commodity, right, by things like mobility as a service in Finland, which is really exciting, where most young people are saying, actually, I don't really want to own a car. I'm more interested in dialing up a service or a single platform on your phone. You can dial up any mobility service, be a ferry, a car, a bike, a tram. Yeah, so I think this is probably the way that car culture is going to corrode, rather than people realising the ills of the motor car. But obviously the car-free movement is as old as the car itself, so a good dose of citizen action, which I'll put into each of these areas, is really key, right? Because this stuff doesn't just happen because some technocrats in City Hall decide that actually it's a good thing to do now. Because citizen movements will drive this stuff, and that what we're seeing that certainly now in terms of XR and movements like that. But some of the big car-free days, especially in places like Delhi, where mobilising millions of people, right, to get out of the cars and have alternatives. So unlocking the car-free cities, getting rid of cars means getting rid of the conditions that makes us need cars. Yeah, that is simply it. And what are the conditions that simply make us need cars? That's the challenge to unpack. It's about a new mobility paradigm that nowhere, as far as I am aware, creates their mobility systems in a way specifically address climate breakdown, social inequality, and just living well within limits. Yeah, but that needs to be the hallmark, the signature theme tune of any mobility the design of a mobility system. Yeah, and doing so would create a very different mobility system. All right, so that's transport. And probably quite a lot there. I'm going to flick through the others so we can get to some kind of like a bit more of a debate. And just a final look at, it can be done. The point is, this is not unassailable, right? This is kind of like, there are kind of gaps all over the place. Tokyo, really low ownership. Helsinki, really getting towards being a car-free city more than any place in the world. And Venice, those that you've been there, never seen a car in its life. The whole city powered by little trolleys, right? And it can be done in a very high consumption area, yeah? So people's social acceptability there is shifting really rapidly. Right, so the post-carbon city, let's have a look at that then. Proposition 2, we've got this aging, centralised, corporate-controlled, externally dependent, carbon-intensive energy system, right? Especially in this country, in other countries there's greater moves, and this is going to be one of the exciting debating points, actually, because, here we are at CAT, where there's great knowledge on this stuff, yeah? And there's a huge amount of movement in this area, but how do we up the pace? How do we change the pace of the movement here, yeah? And I think some of the technical knowledge in this room will help us understand that. But it's about unlocking a particular dynamic, right? A civic energy revolution, distributed energy networks, local smart grids, municipal energy systems, net negative developments. So I think there's a particular politics here, a particular set of policy measures which we're pointing to. And Paul Allen was in Leeds last week and we had some great debates about this. So how do we take the technically feasible plan like ZCB and really start to think about what that means in terms of local infrastructure capabilities and configurations within urban localities. Because, we all know this kind of stuff. We've had this amazing temporary energy bonanza, right? Here we are in the oil age, yeah, as Richard Heinberg points it out. We're having a great time here. A small amount, a small subsection of global humanity just now is having a great time. We're having a great time. We're warm, we're well fed, we're here. Actually, the interesting thing I normally posit is that actually I say that imagine if we took oil out of this particular room and there wouldn't be much left. But this is probably one of the only rooms that is the opposite, because there'd be plenty left without oil, actually, given the natural materials that make this space. But, oil absolutely determines our life. The carbon age is saturated in oil, and unraveling the structural conditions that have led to oil dependency across every area of our life is the challenge, yeah? Because to reconnect with non-fossil fuel-based resources across so many different areas is obviously the big challenge. And the post-carbon city challenge is the big one, because decoupling city life from high energy and high emission outputs is the key challenge. One of the key things that I'm looking forward to engaging more about with the ZCB community is obviously so the zero carbon frameworks are technically feasible, yeah? Whether they're politically tolerable or financially viable is another thing, but they probably are as well, yeah? they're probably doable, and that's why we're lobbying for that, raising ambition and really getting the word out there. The negative carbon emission scenarios are more challenging because I suggest it structurally changes the functioning of the economy, towards that more post-capitalist dynamic, which is beyond that growth dynamic, which sets in chain a set of structural events and system-wide change, which may or may not be tolerable, So I think it changes the structural functioning of the economy. I think that's the big challenge, because we need a new narrative to sell it, right? We can't sell it on the terms of the old economy, right? Which most low carbon, carbon neutral, and net zero carbon narratives are sold on, right? It needs a paradigm change, and that's the big difference. And I think how we do that as a community is the key thing, and especially around demand curtailment, So that's, for me, this is a really big challenge. Because we have got all this stuff, again, the low-hanging fruit, zero-emission neighbourhoods, all great stuff, BedZ, Freiburg, Vauban, and, this is UC Davis, lovely kind of net zero, carbon neutral campus there. And, cities all over the world claiming, 100% renewable strategies. This is all kind of doable, 100% renewably owned municipal energy companies, selling energy at a discount. All this stuff's doable out there. It's the low-hanging fruit because it hasn't precipitated structural change in the economy. But we are seeing the glimmers of this bubbling up of this civic potential around civic energy revolution, the likes of Repower London and the likes of Edinburgh Solar Corp, what you've got here in the Diffie Valley and things, and the big Stadtwerks of Germany that they're still trying to break through in terms of that structurally changing the way the market works, and all sorts of micro initiatives in Africa. But again, a good dose of people's action, because it will be the citizen action. I mean, let's face it, if we're going to have a moratorium on fossil fuel energy, it will come through us showing solidarity with those people who live on top of them, right? And that is one of the key things, because across the world, and especially in urban environments where large-scale fracking is still occurring, it's showing solidarity with those people who are sat on top of these fossil fuel reserves. So when they're saying leave it in the ground, that's a purposeful connecting with those groups to do that kind of thing. Right, the BioCity, the third one's about nature. I like this because it's got an existential dimension to it as well, because it's about us and about our relationship, right? Because Proposition 3 really is this lockdown of this ecosystem degradation, this resource depletion, but this commodification of nature, and this, for me, this binary, right, between humans and nature, this us and them, this culture nature which has developed over the decades, right, over the centuries. And how do we reconnect? How do we create a new, don't like to talk about deals at the moment, but the new human city nature deal, right? How do we start to reconnect people, place and nature, in some kind of deeper set of reliance and interconnections and non-commodified relationships, right? Because there's plenty of nature coming into cities in a very commodified ecosystem service approach, but how do we start to kind of value nature in its own right, and therefore reconstruct our relationship and how we see ourselves against our natural world? And here's where it all started, Here's a sideline lecture which goes off into, several hours somewhere else about how did we get here? What are the structural conditions through which we got here, And that, if we don't talk about this stuff, then we don't get to the kind of bottom of it all. Because, we do live in a city of industry and enclosure and profit, And it all started this corner of the world, 250 years ago, where we weren't so good to each other, and the feudal order broke down, and we all moved into a huge social experiment, right, in vast industrial cities, where the industrial capitalist city emerged, and now has become a global model and spread throughout the world, and that's just what happened, and it's now this motive of continued dispossession, continued enclosure, continues throughout the world, and it's that driving force, right, which Marx and Engels saw, and then we've understood, right, as a driving force of the accumulation of surplus capital, which keeps the whole thing going, right? And we see it today, big peri-urban developments spreading out into their kind of precious, pristine ecosystems on the edge of global cities. And really, what we're realizing now is actually we're in a largely kind of fairly stable, redundant part of the world, right? well, apart from our scope 3 emissions, which are going through the roof. But, the big growth is humanity is going to be made or broken in terms of, a handful of megacities which are emerging across the global south, right? The Kinshasas, the Manilas, right? The Jakartas of this world. And it's the vast growth there, how they will lay down particular modes of living and social practices within cities will determine the real big levels of carbon emissions, yeah? And how we relate to each other globally, right? Who are they? What are they for? What's their narrative? What's our narrative? Is their narrative to be perpetuated as part of this neo-colonial economy, providing cheap goods for us? And is our narrative here to be high consumers, to keep consuming those goods that they're making for us, right? So there's a global narrative there. And how do we get to something different? For example, biophilic cities, this deep connection to nature, biophilia, this innate emotional affiliation of human beings to other organisms and the emotional and psychological benefits that are derived through those connections, yeah? And this biophilic cities movement, which is emerging across the world, some wonderful lessons coming from the biophilic cities movement. Have you got your hand up for a question?
Is that a picture or is it made up?
I looked into that actually because it does look quite enticing, doesn't it? I think they've put, this is from Tim Beatley's book, the Biophilic Cities Handbook. I think it's probably green gloss on there, isn't there? But I think what it's trying to get at is, I've got some better examples, and I think a lot of you might be looking at green infrastructure right in cities, that how do we not just put nature in cities in a tokenistic way, but how do we fundamentally start to design an environment which is based on this connection? So it's not an urban environment with a bit of nature added, but it's a new type of environment which is human nature environment, right? We don't even have the language to understand that, yeah. And I think that's the conceptual leap we're making. Probably there's elements in CAP that represent this, yeah. And that also means other non-animal species, non-human animal species as well, yeah. Birmingham's, because what you get a lot of hubris around this, yeah. So Birmingham in the UK is declared itself a biophilic city. It's got some great continuous productive landscapes and green corridors, that kind of stuff. But so there's an interesting biophilic cities movement around the world. So do take a look at their website and what they're doing. But I think the broader principle is, that connection to nature is one of our safety valves, because the more we connect with nature, the more we understand it, the more we protect it and preserve it. I think that's a fairly established thing now, yeah? And I think one of the things we're concerned about is the disconnection of many young people from nature because of the type of schooling system we have in this particular country in particular. But, so there's all sorts of examples. There's the, kind of Pilson Street, some great blue-green infrastructure there. I know you're looking at in this module. It's the longest blue-green corridor, I think, in the world. There's kind of High Line there in the States. A lot of these are quite kind of like, almost quasi-gentrified. One of the key things about blue-green infrastructure and new green infrastructure in cities is that they can fuel processes of gentrification, right? So they can increase values. So how do we do this bearing in mind the next thing I'm going to talk about? Stuff like the Bullitt Centre in Seattle and Santilli Towers in Milan, when we put up skyscrapers, let's do it this way. And I think there's people in the room who will know much more than me about the particularities of doing it that way. But, because these are air purifiers, these can be kind of affordable apartments, they can be carbon scrubbers, all sorts of stuff like that, and massively increased biodiversity, yeah, and well-being. I mentioned farming because I know a lot of you are into urban food, but for me it's super key, and, there's much more to be said about it. That's one of my favourite projects in Michigan. But how we can reconnect to natural landscapes in cities, through urban wilding by reconnecting with other animal species and other ecosystems, but also through growing food, which is and it's so many co-benefits to these things, co-benefits to putting animals and food back into our cities, yeah. Okay, and it's beyond the tokenistic stuff of crows, badgers, squirrels, and foxes, right? How do we fundamentally start to reconceive existentially who we are as humans, a human animal species with other animal species? I think that's a big deal, and that will come from a long process of generational re-education and relearning about who we are, right? If we are losing that level of a species annually, because this is about a new urban nature deal, right? A change in the relationship between humans, nature, other species, and urban space, right? Away from this kind of stuff, which is locking into all the things we've been talking about, yeah? But we're still doing this on every arterial route, in every city in Britain, no matter that our city leaders are coming out with all this stuff about being zero carbon by 2030 or whatever, or 2038. I bet that, you know, they're all sitting on a pile of planning applications which they can't say no to, because if they say no to it, it'll get overturned at national planning level, to pile our arterial routes and our consumer habits and our daily social practices with this stuff, right? This stuff has to just stop. There needs to be a moratorium on that stuff. There needs to be a complete overhaul of the Town and Country Planning Act, and the RTPR has a big role to play here, right, in terms of stopping this stuff dead in its tracks tomorrow. Towards this kind of stuff, yeah? Just opening up green space, opening up educational practices and social practices around reconnecting with nature anywhere and everywhere. You know, it's, obviously being someone like Kat, you can live it and breathe it, but when we go back to our cities and our communities, you know, we all see where this needs to be rolled out. So the final one, this is the most important one in a way, because this is the one that everything hangs around, because it's a political and democratic realignment, yeah? Because it's, in a way, we'll probably all think, well, how is all this stuff going to happen? And because a lot of this stuff's happening anyway, but how do we make it happen faster? So proposition 4, you know, we've got a lot of stuff here. We've got this alienated placement. We don't make places very well in Britain, right? We've got very corporate controlled urban economies, and we've got a very distorted democracy, yeah? We don't make decisions very well, not very participatory, not very representative, certainly not very empowering. How do we unlock something different, what I call a city commons? Yeah? Citizen housing, common ownership, the social economy, community wealth, citizen forums, and a good dose of civil disobedience. Because we've got a very uncommon city, right? So we live in very uncommon times, something deeply amiss. Growing gap between haves and have-nots. You know, the whole Brexit story was about this. You know, we've not attended to it for 40 years, and it's blown up in our faces, and it's continuing to grow because now we're talking about the Irish backstop, whatever that is, in terms of the deep divide in our society, which led to the crisis in the first place, yeah? And the social crisis, the capitalist crisis, perpetuated the climate crisis. So one of my other concerns is now we've been sidelined into talking about plastic-free supermarket aisles, instead of actually what the structural conditions which are reproducing the wider climate crisis, yeah? I mean, our city democracies are simply not ready for the challenges ahead. We have 20th century, or even 19th century, and somehow even almost medieval political systems trying to deal with 21st century problems, yeah, wicked, complex problems, and it's simply not working, yeah? And on top of that, we've got a big capital, globalised, pro-growth economy. It's got almost an entire free hand to do whatever it wants with making urban places. And that's one of the terrifying prospects, because we're still seeing that in terms of mass land acquisitions, mass privatisation of urban space. Yeah. And on top of that, we've got an abstract planning system which is absolutely tamed by this corporate lobbying, especially through concentration of land and land banking. Yeah. But still, we are building the urban common, right? So there's an amazing set of new practices going on there, right, within the economy. The commons, we kind of know the commons. You know, we've all been to a village with a common, right? We kind of got a sense that they were managed by the commoners, yeah? And there was some kind of equilibrium there which allowed that resource to be managed. But now that obviously the commons is we have common knowledge, common patents, common ideas, institutions. So we know that the commons is a broad and empowering metaphor for our times, right? That it's about how we can manage our relationships and our institutions in a way that will re-nurture those life support systems, yeah? Because the cities are the ultimate commons, you know, even towns, you know, or whatever, you know, they're the ultimate commons. They're the rich connections we can create between people are always a possibility for this stuff. And the city common in action, all sorts of stuff, you know, the collaborative economy, digital platform cooperatives which are emerging, you know, in contrast to the likes of Airbnb, Uber, Deliveroo, all this kind of stuff. There are cooperative alternatives, right, which are flourishing and growing. Fairmondo, Lumio, all this kind of stuff, which are growing in their place. Community ownership is really taking off as a model. You know, the Cleveland model now come to Britain as the Preston model, where you create anchor institutions to circulate wealth in low-income neighbourhoods. All this can be done, yeah? All this can be reconfigured. We know how to retain money locally, yeah, to build community wealth. Because Our communities are leaky buckets, right? We've established that many years ago. Trickle down doesn't work. They're leaky buckets. And those holes lead to corporate boardrooms, right? And how do we plug those gaps and get that money recirculating back in our local economies to use that wealth to build climate safety, right? Because that's what we are good at. Civil society, we use that wealth well because we know how to build socially just, climate-safe activities, yeah? And that we need to capture that wealth so we can do that because civil society is brilliant at this. Things like community land trusts. I help set up Leeds community homes where we're trying to replicate low-impact, affordable low-impact housing across the city. People-powered housing, some great examples, you know. Almere, which has now got this custom-built dynamic in it in the Netherlands. This climate innovation district in Leeds, which is great, you know, some private developers there doing some really interesting, not affordable, but interesting low-impact housing. You know, co-housing as a model, you know, this is Bristol Community Land Trust, you know, so people doing interesting stuff, and I think it's unleashing that potential, yeah? And then stuff like Wikihouse, you know, open source homemaking through digital manufacture. If this stuff comes together, and it probably will do, but will it come through fast enough? That's the issue. Completely changing the way we make our housing. That will be the exciting stuff, because all this stuff is just around the corner if we can lay down the infrastructure to make it happen. And that's the place I live, so Lilac's part of this story as well, where we built 20 straw bale homes, and we live there very happily as a cooperative and trying to encourage other people to do so. And the big challenge is retrofit housing, yeah? So retrofitting this into existing neighbourhoods, because not everyone can find a new build plot, right? And then civic democracy. Crowdsourcing citizen ideas and creating a democratic agenda around them. I think that's the exciting thing, yeah? And of course, the final dash of civil disobedience, and we're seeing more and more of this, you know, the exciting thing about Friday with the Youth for Climate strike, yeah? I think we're in the middle of a paradigm shift, yeah? We're in the middle of another one of these moments where history speeds up. It's really exciting, and we'll look back on February 2019, just like maybe the 2008 crash, right? Just like other periods in time, the Battle of Seattle, the other moments against when the anti-globalization movement was very strong, or the miners' strike, or the Cultural Revolution of '68. I think something's happening just now, which is very exciting, yeah? Because the young people are playing this back to us. Young people are playing back to us the deficiencies which we collectively, not individually, have created, yeah? And the absence that we have created in between the generations. Right, so where have we arrived? What is all this? You know, what is the vision that is laid out here? Yeah? What is this place? It's a car-free, negative emissions, commons-based bio-city, yeah? I mean, that just sounds crazy, it's silly. I mean, what is that? We need to create a positive vision around it. The point is we need a new narrative, and I think we all know the elements of that positive vision. It's a beautiful place, thriving communities. We can create an abundant commons, right, where we can generate community wealth, have pleasurable mobility, right, sufficient energy, safe future together. I think this is the kind of thing that we need to create a narrative around that we don't have at the moment. So all that stuff around post-capitalism, post this, post that, I mean, that's not going to work, right? That's kind of like, you know, I'm putting some big ideas out there, but we need to translate that into a persuasive vision in a way that the transition town movements has done over the years and other movements around the world continue to do. And how will we get there? Well, it won't be any one single sector doing this on their own. This is called the quadruple helix, right, in academic terms, which is an interesting phrase at the best of times. But what it suggests is that these four sectors working together can come up with really innovative social innovations. And that's nothing new, actually, right? So what do we need instead, given the crisis? We need people to work outside of the business as usual paradigm, yeah? We need those breakaway public servants who are going to go, I'll back you, I'm just sick of this workplace, and I'm sick of my boss, and I'm just sick of it doing this way, because what I have to do in my day job is so annoying. We need renegade academics, because I love 50% of my colleagues at University of Leeds. I'm really annoyed at the other 50%, right? Because they're just perpetuating the status quo at a very high expensive level. So we need renegade academics to use that knowledge and get it out there at the deployment of climate safety and social justice. We need dissident industrialists, right? Who are going to say, we've got the facilities, the resources, the means of production here. We need to put it. We need to re-engineer this to these ends. And we need rebellious citizens who are going to pull all this together and say, look, actually, we need to do this. We need to take each other on and ourselves on to work in coordination with entrepreneurs, with academics, with public sector officials and councillors in new ways. And I think that then this breakaway movement is happening, and I think that's when the magic happens. And what happens here, there's 3 levels. There's the top, middle and bottom, or what you call it in academic terms, the macro, meso and micro. Macro, meso and micro. What you've got is all these little, at the micro level, all these little grassroots projects, yeah? Community gardens, energy companies, all that kind of stuff, energy cooperatives, they're all great, right? 20 home cooperatives, micro. And at the macro, you've got the big state, all its resources, all its technological ability, all its, power. But what we haven't got much of is in the middle is this meso level. And that's the civic level. That's that thickness that you often have in other countries, especially France and Germany and the Netherlands, where it's a broker between the 2 levels. Pulls down resources from the big state and encourages the state to change its practices and become more participatory, and it connects and makes the micro examples connect and flourish. And that is the key to it, this middle level, right? And that's what this lot can do together, because this middle level is the key to change. We don't have much of it in Britain. So you need this enabling democratic macro level, you need this kind of experimental micro level, and you need this really supportive middle level. That's where we need to get to. And this way, yeah, so this old adage is one of my favourites, because it's about thinking big, starting small, but acting now. So thank you.
Just kick my tea over. Don't worry, nothing in it. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, no, thank you.
For those of us who are on the module this week, there's a lot of links with that lecture, with a lot of the other things that we're talking about in more minutiae, especially green infrastructure today and also transport tomorrow. It's going to be lots of links, and I'm sure with the other lecturers as well.
Great.
So I'd like to invite questions, if that's okay. And if you can wait for me to run up to you with the mic, it means everyone can hear the question. Right, so at the back first.
I was just wondering how you funded and designed is it called Lilac, your cooperative housing scheme?
We got a commercial bank loan from Triodos Bank. Yeah.
Oh, Triodos. Okay.
Yeah, and because it was a member co-op, we got a certain amount of startup capital from our members as deposits. That was member cooperative capital. And then the rest was a bank loan. Yeah. And there's a detailed story behind how the Lilac finances work, but we try to decommodify the way we live, and you all pay a third of your income, and it's all quite complex. One for the bar afterwards, it's pretty bad. Was
it difficult to put into place? Did you have planning barriers, and did you have lots of issues, or overall was it fairly easy? Or no?
Yeah, and I've written a whole other book about Lilac actually, and it's so I mean, essentially when we designed it and laid it out, when we went through the planning process, we almost, from the planner's point of view, we almost did, everything we did was wrong. The houses were too close together, they were misaligned, the gardens were too small, there was too much communal space, not enough car parking, they wanted a big adopted highway. So I think we just turned everything on its head. And in the end, they just held their hands up and said, look, it's an experiment, test it through the planning system. So it worked, and we went from the bad boys and girls to the poster boys and girls. So now they've been planning interns for look at best practice, even though we had a massive bun fight with them over all sorts. So there's a lot of sticking power there. It was tricky, you could easily give up. But I think what cracked it was that it was a community-led process. So we authentically went to them as a bunch of residents, community developers, and said, look, we want to do this. There's nobody behind us. It's just us. So I think that was the power of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what was that project built on? Was it like greenfield site, or was it?
What, the Lilac project?
Yeah.
Oh, it was an old school, old Victorian school, which Leeds City Council demolished and sold. So it was just a cleared site that we bought in inner city West Leeds. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
One more up here, and then I'll go down to the road below.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a public servant. In fact, I'm a planning officer.
Great.
How do I become a breakaway public servant?
What do you? I'll answer that. But what do you think?
Well, the policies that you came up against, saying a parking space has to be such and such, houses have to be so far apart, etc., are democratically agreed upon. And so we have an issue here where if I want to express my individual creativity, I'm constrained by policy which local people have decided is the best for their county. Now that's a tricky bind to be in. So how do I break away from that bind if I think it's necessary to do the kind of things you're talking about?
So yeah, this is fascinating because we've been talking about having some kind of climate crisis school, where we could engage with professionals from other sectors and say, look, what do we think the issue is, right? And then therefore, how can we change our professional practices as a result? I mean, there is discretion, isn't there, around supplementary planning guidance and stuff, which you can do at a local level. So actually, in Leeds we've got plenty of those, and you could quite easily get the execs board member for regeneration and development to approve the creation of a supplementary planning guidance for low impact communities, right? And they could do that locally. What they're worried about, though, and it's interesting, and all municipalities differ, especially more shire unitary districts and stuff, is that they're just worried that it's all going to get exploited, because they don't like to be exploited, do they? They don't like to be hoodwinked by big developers. So all the things that we want to advocate for, which will promote all this unlocking, the municipalities agree with us, but they're terrified of facilitating that unlocking with us because they just feel it will get completely co-opted and manipulated by powerful players. Yeah. So we will be the door through which the faster destruction of our world will happen. And so therefore we need some new kind of municipal deal, a civic partnership. So rather than public-private partnerships, we need public commons partnerships. Yeah. That's what we would need. In your day job, though, I imagine, it starts very small. So having a lunchtime seminar with your colleagues saying, I've seen all these cool projects because I'm doing this masters. Can I just show you some slides at lunchtime? Yeah. You what? Well, I reckon either you'll keep at them, and either they'll just sack you or kill you or something, or they'll facilitate some of your ideas. They'll probably just say, "You've gone on about this long enough. I think we should just let him have a go." Say, "What about an experimental project? One experimental project." Because actually, what we need in the context of rapid climate and social breakdown are experiments, because we don't really know what's going to work. So, what district are we talking about? You want to keep that anonymous, it's fine. Right, well, I mean, because you've got all sorts of other national facilitating frameworks, haven't you, in Wales, MaaS and stuff and all that, and there's other... But, I mean, you're right. Right.
Which was very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Quite often, in fact, it's national policy, even though Welsh government is well known for being quite green, actually, but it's prohibitive in certain regards as well. achieve the kind of things that you're talking about. And I agree the anti-crime has a big role to play, for example. But again, it's a massive organisation. Those wheels turn very slowly, don't they?
I mean, I think linking up as well, creating networks of people like you across Wales and across the county would be quite powerful, because then you could start to, that's that thickness, isn't it? You can start to push that civic thickness up the next level. Yeah. Use a microphone, because otherwise it will. Yeah, that's right.
In Denbighshire, the council as a whole has been pressurised to adopt a corporate priority of being pro-environment, which is interesting. So slightly tokenistic things like going for a bee-friendly status, for example. But obviously planners have a big opportunity to shape the world for hundreds of years to come. And our local development plan is up for review in the next couple of years. So I would encourage anyone who lives in the locality or is interested in these things to actually take part in a consultation, because we do listen, we do respond to public pressure, and aligning our local development plan with the corporate priority of the environment would be a very good thing in my view.
And I would maybe use the spirit of this Friday and maybe get some school kids to talk to them, you know, because it's like, you know, what society we're bequeathing to the generation who have to live under the conditions that the planning framework is creating now.
I'm looking on this row because I can't be bothered to walk up and down and left and right. Is there anyone in this row before I go down to the next row? Next row. Questions?
So thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the energy as well. In terms of structural changes, this is another question about the economy, which I've already asked one this time. I agree with your analysis personally, and I wondered, can you recommend your top 3 narratives about how we get from where we are now to something like Kate Raworth or any other thinker like that? Because I think that her model, for example, is great. I struggle in the work I do to try and describe to people how we're going to dismantle the AIM market or how we're going to dismantle the Chicago Metals Exchange or something, in order that we get to something that is living within those bounds. Who's written about it that I can read and borrow their ideas?
And specifically in terms of restructuring the economy?
Yeah, because I mean, I think we've got to work from from all the angles, right? And I agree with, I think, what you were saying. But in terms of the overarching stuff, if you're talking to like a businessman and I say, well, we've got to live within these planetary boundaries, and they're like, well, we can't because we've got GDP, and how does it fit within those measurements? And I say we have to dismantle GDP, and then they're like, well, how? So I know what the future could look like, but I'd like to know who's written about, if you can recommend anybody who's written about how we actually get there.
Yeah.
Or maybe.
Well, the cop-out answer is there's loads of references in that chapter in the book that I'll just like reel off of, but they're in the.
Okay.
And but there's other aspects of the measurement aspect's really key, because you know we value what we measure, and I think that's really important, isn't it? And there are experiments in measuring other things, and that's you know the kind of happy city index stuff in Bristol is really powerful, and it's like so that movement is starting. It's a bit stalled. I mean, it has been going on for decades. But the revaluing stuff is really important. The other aspect that's really key is what we call, you know, because we're dealing with systems here, there's like a system element, right? And they're complex systems. So there's all sorts of kind of perverse outcomes and system effects. And one of the things is this lock-in to weak gains. And I think that's one of the key things we can talk to entrepreneurs and policymakers around is like, what are the metrics we use through which we can measure the outcomes? Because we often make investment decisions which lock us into weak gains, which we can't reverse out of for decades. And that's a real problem. And I think what we're probably doing here, this kind of community, is creating the evidence base through which we can stop that lock-in to weak policy outcomes. And you know, stuff like driverless cars and all that kind of stuff is really key to it. But there's probably a few in each sector that you could hold dear to. You know, like pound for pound, where do you get your bangs for your bucks? Because there's so much stuff, isn't there, around like what are the best areas to invest in terms of carbon emissions? You know, if we're dealing with this absolute carbon budget, you know, where is it best deployed? Things like Paul Hawking, right, and drawdown I think what he scoped out with Drawdown is, you know, the exact areas through which, you know, which will yield the biggest net carbon savings, which humanity can focus on. And some of them are quite surprising. So a lot of them are still around conventional, really important issues around family planning issues, right? And other stuff around refrigeration and that kind of stuff. So there's like, where we're going to get our bangs for our bucks is really key. So metrics, lock-in, those kinds of things.
Anyone else? Questions? Anyone wants to?
Just a quick reflection. We are from Denbighshire, and we should have do a car sharing. Just thought that I should have write it to the discussion of this event. If anybody comes from Denbighshire, let's join. So next time, yeah. So it's like an issue that we are not in this narrative, not yet. And but the need is everywhere, I can say, because we just managed to have a community, a small community in Ruthin. There was no eco club. We just started, and I can say that only in a small town there's a need for these things. Like we are talking about to do things of library, rather library of things. It's a new thing, and we are thinking about having some events like a repair cafe in this place. So yeah. We are just the very start of this thing. On the other side, I think it's already too late. So that's why why I'm so engaged with this story. And on the other side, I'm a very proud father of this young lady. She's only 12, and she wanted to come because I just mentioned at home that there's an event. If anybody wants to come, just let me know and join. So it's just the reflections, and sorry, it's hard to speak here because of the big audience, and I'm not English people. I'm from Hungary. I used to work in the administration. I worked for the Hungarian Environmental Protection Agency, something like that. Used to be an officer, and I'm very happy that I'm here and things going like this. That's this like the cat over here. When I found it, I just I drive. I'm a driver in Wales, and I just go past this place. I just saw the sign that Center for Alternative Technology, and started to follow this place. And I think it's not. It didn't happen accidentally. So I want to make a change. I want to improve myself and everybody else. So and I think it's the other side. I'm volunteering for an international association, and I just want to let you know that there's maybe a hope we can build that meso level. We are working on a platform which called Envienta, and it's an if you search for it online, it's an open source everything. Our motto is that we want to be the Google of the open source blueprints and plans, to share the knowledge and let makerspaces and inventors join this platform to work together to open up and fasten up improvements and developments of new plans and projects. So just wanted to let you know. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
That's just a wonderful set of comments. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I'm not going to really respond to it, but that was just wonderful to engage with you and see you here. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. We've got a consultation happening in Machynlleth, starting, there's actually a public open meeting tonight, so the council has declared a climate emergency and has now got a 6-month consultation with members of the public. Just wondered what your advice would be about, we've got a local XR group who involved in thinking about how we can influence that process and help that process. Just wondering what your tips or might be for that, and what maybe are the kind of particular pressure points we can think about when talking to members of the public, but also the local council.
So just to clarify, they passed that motion though in Machynlleth. They've done that, yeah? So what is the meeting about now?
The public meeting tonight is to set up a steering group to steer that consultation, and it will take 6 months.
And to determine what a climate emergency might mean for the town?
I think so. I think it's about the quality of life in the town and what local people want. A kind of, I mean, it's quite empty from the council's point of view. It's quite, I think it's just a framework at the moment. So it's really kind of up for grabs in a way.
Because all these places around the world are declaring climate emergencies is quite fascinating, because they all have to then fill it with content, right? And some of them have targets and roadmaps anyway, so maybe Nottingham's declaration to get to 2028, zero carbon 2028, is another way of just declaring a climate emergency, because you'd set that roadmap anyway, yeah? But like you said, that wedging light, it's what you fill it with, right? So we could get to zero carbon in quite a lot of ways, and everyone's talking about the climate emergency, but it's like there's been a social emergency for decades, you know. And it's what we do along the way, it's how we get there. So what the content through which we embark upon that carbon down curve and the social and political nature of that down curve. Because, you know, we could get to that global carbon budget quite easily through some kind of eco-fascist state at a national, regional or international level, no problem, right? We could certainly do that. The state's not going anywhere anytime soon. The billionaires are hunkering down, right, and getting their bunkers sorted out. They know what's coming. So I think, as part of a citizen-led process, which the transition towns have been doing for several decades already, right, in the UK and beyond. But I think the change happens when there's three things, right? The three preconditions. One is that there's a clear sense of what the problem is, the crisis is, and why we need to move away from it. Then there's a clear sense of what the kind of place in the sun is, what the future, the progressive, more positive future is. And the third thing is, there's a narrator that can explain the journey, why we need to go from here to get to here. Tony Blair was really good at it, that's why he won an election like that, and he thought about it a long time, right? And many populists are quite good at it, because you can tweak, you can set your own, you know, narrative about what now is, what the crisis is, and what the amazing resolution of that crisis is. And if you're a plausible storyteller, you could bring a whole lot of people with you. So I think that's the power of stories here, the power of narratives and the power of stories are going to be key to it. So how does Machynlleth tell a new story about the town, right? Which is not about, which is a response to the climate emergency, yeah? Because you ain't going to get that far. I mean, what I understand what happened here, what Paul Allen explained, was around that you got the not the usual suspects involved in calling it, and that was really powerful. So like the Women's Institute rather than the Green Party, that kind of thing. And I think that's when things really shift, when you get people beyond the norm, beyond the expected people to do that, yeah? And it's got to be, you know, the youth aspect is just like, you know, what we don't want to do as adults is use the younger generation as kind of political pawns to advocate a particular message. But when they can speak authentically from their own position, I think that just blows everything out of the water, because it reverses the whole equation. So the Youth Council of Machynlleth, or the Youth Council of the county, I think is the key to this, really. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering what your opinion is on like ecosystem services and the fact that maybe it's like a bit dangerous. It's like moving towards something that's like, I don't know, moving towards biodiversity, but also like perpetuating like a like deep disconnect between people and nature and like these things with underneath the capitalist structure. I don't know what, yeah, I'd like to know what your opinion is about something that, yeah, maybe is going towards something that's green, but also like severing that connection between people.
No, absolutely right. So something like the the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, right, is a framework through which you can understand the different attributes of an ecosystem service, and you can kind of get it, aesthetic and then productive and sustaining various ecosystems. And that's kind of like, for me, that's a way in. So people can, for people not familiar with understanding nature, you can see that natural systems like, water, air, soil, play different functions in their life which perpetuate adults. And it's like, so perpetuate humans. Actually, it's like, no shit, Sherlock. Of course they do that. That's brilliant. Trees are good for us, plants are good for us, soil, seeds, air, water, clean. They need to be clean and productive, yeah? But it's when it's used as part of the neoliberal world, right? To further commodify and sell, right? So actually, because what we laid out in that framework, what capitalism needs to perpetuate itself, it needs to find new areas to latch on to generate value and generate surplus value. So it sees forests, it sees seas, it sees air as something to capture and buy and to sell to the highest bidder as a value on a shareholder's boardroom, right? So that's the problem, isn't it? When it becomes that. So instead, we need to have a ecosystem service commons, right? Flip it right on its head. So the value of ecosystem services is its common value. And it's how it can sustain us in common, but how it can sustain well-being in common, and how it can create a commonality between the stuff I said before around animal species, human species, non-human species, human species, and plant species, yeah? And that would be an ecosystem common for me, which would be really powerful, which wouldn't have a monetary value, but it would have a use value, and it would have a common value. And we could create legal frameworks around that in a way that kind of, is it Ecuador have done around, valuing kind of natural features? So I think there's an important legal framework to protect common ecosystem services. I think I got there with that answer. I kind of made it up a bit, but because it's not my area, but I am interested in it.
I think your issue about narratives is very important. I think, however, that our narrative is facing many other narratives that are equally strong, or perhaps even stronger. It's not a case that we're fighting against people who don't want the same goals as us. There's new narratives appearing which have the goal as a lovely place to live and we've solved climate problems. But their narratives are, we can carry on developing, planning, building over green sites, but we can restore other sites better. We can restore ecosystems. We have the technology. We don't have to. They have narratives like we don't have to change the way we live. We can use technology. These are very strong narratives, and the people with these narratives are creating reality on the ground now. We have councils in England which are piloting biodiversity offsetting. I don't know whether that's in Wales as well, but this is part of that narrative where we can have our cake and eat it. But they also have the means of communication, they have access to media. And so we not only have to have a very good narrative, we have to actually get that access and the power of the message to get across, because we are in a massive battle of narratives at the moment.
Yeah, and you're right, and that whole narrative, it's just kind of like zombie capitalism, right? It's infected everything we do and everything we touch. This whole, the market forces behind every single element, that biodiversity becomes this thing that you can somehow profit from, but we can only commodify it to protect it. That kind of, it's very pervasive. New public management is full of this. So every council in the world, every boardroom in the world, every boardroom in Britain, every kind of council office, on their desk on a Monday morning would be a report from KPMG not from the Centre for Alternative Technology. That's the point. That where are they getting this stuff from? They're not just making it up, right? The chief execs of our municipalities are being led by the likes of Deloitte and KPMG, not by the likes of Transition Towns and Centre for Alternative Technology, even though we've got a much more powerful narrative about the future. Yeah? And how do we create that institutional thickness to make our messages stick and get out there? I mean, you're right, but there's lots of other messages as well. I mean, the alt-right, right, is the big one, right, globally. I mean, crikey, that's a threat beyond belief, isn't it?
So having the narrative is not good enough. You have to have the delivery.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And that's what the neoliberals of the 40s and 50s realised, didn't they? Because they created that institutional thickness to get their message and consolidate that across the planet in a way to stop what they saw as a threat of democratic socialism, yeah? And they did it. You know, we need our own institutions to embed this in a much stronger way than we've currently got. We have all the answers, right? Civil society has all the answers to social justice and climate breakdown. We don't have the institutional kind of like thickness to launch it from. Okay.
I think we've got one more question,
yeah,
if that's all right. And then are you available in the bar after?
I'm staying here tonight, so I'll be drinking the bar. Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So we have one more question, and then we'll finish.
Thanks. I think it's possibly more of an observation and possibly an offer. I think you refer to Dorling and you refer to Kay Raworth work, and what's interesting there is actually it's a very clear narrative that, you know, growth is not succeeding, it's creating greater inequality, it's not addressing well-being. And one of the things I found a bit challenging this morning was we had a discussion about city mayors and how the mayoral model is possibly the way forward. A mayoral model that actually adopts the same economic model that we've had for the last few decades that have just caused us all of these problems is not going to work. And I think increasingly we have to find the space where we can build the arguments that actually the status quo is not acceptable. And I find quite persuasive the idea of a climate crisis school because, again, I'm a politician from Birmingham. I've seen a mayoral system that just repeats everything that goes through. I see a city council that's already sold out and given in to big business because we actually use our land to underpin the costs of austerity. So it's again how we break that system down, and actually at times just finding a few people in the same room and finding a bit of bravery together, I think would be a good way forward.
Yeah, and no, I mean you're right, and mayors are a mixed blessing, aren't they? They're very charismatic led, and it's like you're at the whim of whether they're going to be a progressive one or not. If CAT was established today, I think rather than being called the Centre for Alternative Technology, it'd be called the Climate Centre for Climate Emergency, you know. And I think probably what we need on the back of this strike this Friday is for the young people of this country to set up a centre for climate, a hub for climate emergency in every locality in Britain, and launch a movement from that, right? Because this has got to be a civic response, and then on the back of that, those dissident entrepreneurs and all that kind of thing will come there because they'll realise actually they're not jumping ship. This is joining the lifeboat. This is joining the kind of like thing that's going to hold us all together. So that's the real power for me. And this is going to be, it's going to be tough, isn't it? But I think, because next week there's this Northern Powerhouse conference in Leeds. There's Andy Burnham, all the mayors getting together, and they're just zombie leaders, right? I mean, they're going through the motions. I mean, there's little kind of benefits around the edges. You know, of course there is, like Manchester's doing X, Y, and Z, and it's great, isn't it? But like actually getting to the heart of the matter is not an electoral strategy. So we need to develop that institutional thickness, that civic response, because it's going to need at least a generation of relearning, right? And our schools are a real problem, aren't they? You know, like, so those of you who've got primary and secondary age kids, you know they come home with their homework and it's like, really? You know, get straight back out there and tell your head teacher that, you know, this is not good enough. And that's what's happening now, isn't it? You know, Greta Thunberg, you know, just like, it's brilliant, isn't it? And you know, I know you're all saying it now, and it's like, the house is on fire. This is an emergency. You know, how many people are repeating the words of a 16-year-old around the planet? Right.
Good time to thank you for your...
Yeah, well, thank you.